So Mike, really good to have you on board. You know, it's really important that we basically get people like yourselves, you know, CEOs or MATs, you know, and actually a big MAT as well, on board, because it's really important for, I think, EdTech and the people who are listening to this anyway, to understand exactly what your needs and your pain points are at the moment, because ultimately we should always be building solutions to meet your needs, you know, and I think, and sometimes I think we can easily forget that. We can get tied into the technical and go, oh, what a great solution. But the fact if it doesn't meet something you need, then ultimately we've got it wrong. And I think that's really important for us to always appreciate. So thank you for coming on board.
It's good to be here today, Nick.
Thank you. So, Mike, you've had a big and fast career. I was looking at how you progressed through. So you were ahead, and that was in 2010. So that was the John Taylor Academy. You've also, which is also quite interesting, because I think sometimes also people forget some of the other elements of education, in the sense that you're a national teaching school as well. So you basically got John Taylor as a national teaching school, which is really important because they're quite influential schools, because they're teaching schools.
Yeah, I mean, the teaching school concept came from teaching hospitals, actually, you know, because obviously when people sort of hear the phrase teaching school, it's kind of, well, isn't every school a teaching school, you know? But its initial raison d'etre was to provide professional development for initial teacher training, so trainee teachers, and then professional development for teachers and leaders throughout their career, and then to undertake some work to support other schools, which was hugely fulfilling for those involved, and valuable for those that were receiving the support as well. So that was a really exciting time for us. Yeah. And actually that created our movement towards becoming a MAT.
Okay, and actually is the teaching school is an interesting concept, in the sense, if you are somebody who's passionate about education, it means, I guess, for some teachers, they go out and actually teach and sort of support other teachers and support their growth. So you don't necessarily always have to go through, go through the management sort of process of going to head teacher. You can actually, still be, or have influence, I guess, and support other teachers around your, I'm guessing, authority, or no, it's wider than the authority, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I mean, the catchment of the teaching school was quite extensive and somewhat self-selecting. Actually, we would work with people who wanted to work with us. Okay. It was a very permissive model. It wasn't a command and control model that you might say MultiAcademy Trusts are, for instance. But we worked with those who wanted to work with us, and there's nothing more rewarding than feeling that you can make a difference to a setting that welcomes you into it to make that difference. And so teachers and leaders at all levels gained an enormous amount from that sort of work, because it allows you to paint on a broader canvas in terms of your own skill set and your own experience, because even quite a large school like John Taylor High School has its limits in terms of how much you can influence. But the other thing about it, I think, as well, was that when it comes to sharing your practice with others, there's nothing that makes you sort of question and reflect on your own skill set and your own practice than trying to impart, your knowledge, your wisdom, your experience into others. And whether that's through initial teacher training, or that's working with colleagues in different settings, it can be a real good sense check in terms of, well, actually, is my own practice as it needs to be before I start sharing it with others. So a really good reflexive model that worked for both recipient school and delivering school, and we got a huge amount from that.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose you can keep on tweaking the cultures and the behaviours and the way that you want to, or you want your school ultimately to act and behave, I guess, in some ways. Oh man, amazing. And did you find that some of those teachers that did go out and, support other schools, did you find that they actually gained also more leadership sort of skills and qualities?
Yeah, and sometimes, of course, they came back with some really good, tangible practice themselves. We find that, even in a world-class school, there's practice that needs improving, and even in a school which Ofsted would require, would suggest requires improvement or was inadequate, there will still be facets of terrific practice. And so, nobody has a monopoly on expertise, and there's no such thing as a perfect school. So, as well as refining their own leadership skills and their own leadership development, they would come back actually with aspects of practice that they would bring back into their home school. But working with others from outside your own organisation has all sorts of challenges and opportunities. Challenges that it takes a while to get sort of below the surface of the iceberg to see perhaps what's really going on. But the opportunity is perhaps for an element of reinvention for some colleagues, that their history, as it were, doesn't precede them when it comes to a fresh engagement with a colleague in another school. And so it's been incredibly rewarding, that work. And as I say, it was a precursor really for us moving from a single academy trust, the first in Staffordshire in 2010, to being a multi-academy trust in 2014, which is when we got MAT articles.
And now you've got 15 schools, is that correct?
15 schools at the moment. We've got a 16th, which is a primary free school that opens in September. That's hugely exciting for us. And we've got several other schools that we hope will join us by the end of the calendar year. So 10 primaries, 5 secondaries at the moment.
Wow.
And we think that balance between primary and secondary is really rich. It's for us in terms of the dissemination of practice from one phase to another, and really trying to see children in quite a holistic sense in terms of their educational journey, from nursery provision right the way through to post-16 and beyond. And we think that model works for us. Yeah,
I can understand that. I think that sort of seeing the child, the child persists throughout their education, and sort of understanding and being able to support them, you almost need to know them. I think there's an element of that. So taking them all the way through from nursery all the way through into secondary and beyond is, well, not beyond yet, but is I think is a really positive aspect of what MATs can do, really.
And that extends right the way up to the directors of the trust. We have a nursery manager on the trust board, and we also have a lecturer from a higher education institution. So and we've got a secondary school head teacher from another trust on the board as well. So in addition to all of the financial, business, legal acumen that you'd expect a well-run board to have, we have those educationalists who will give us that sense check that when we're looking at a trust-wide development, they can say, actually, have you considered what this will look like in an early years setting or in post-16? And that's really useful for us as well, Nick.
Yeah, I can understand. And so how big do you think where do you see, I suppose, what do you think is a perfect size MAT, I suppose?
I mean, I think that's the killer question, isn't it? When we first became a MAT in 2014, we had a school join us in 2015. We've never cold called anybody. We've never actually had a strategic plan that requires us to grow. We've always lived within our means, and so we've always, again, a bit like the person providing some school support. You want to be walking into a door that's already been opened for you by the host, and we very much have treated our engagement in that way. When it comes to the optimal size, the sweet spot, I think, is not so far off where we are now. We have that dynamic where everybody can still sit around a table, admittedly quite a big table now. But we all know each other and each other's schools. We can undertake peer reviews. We're in quite a tight geographical footprint, and in many ways that is more important to us than the number of schools that we have, because when it comes to technology, of course, when lockdowns happened and our schools were working largely as we're working today, distance wasn't a factor in terms of calling people together, and we still do that in some forums. But when it comes to things like moderating each other's assessment work, when it comes to peer reviews of each other's practice in terms of lesson observations and what have you, there's no substitute to boots on the ground. And the further afield you are, the more stretched you are, I think the more that there is the risk of a cultural lack of cohesion and a lack of harmony. Particularly, I think over time that grows greater. At the moment, we're in that sweet spot where not only are we in a tight geographical location, but as the CEO who was there at the beginning, all of the heads whose schools have joined or have been appointed, we all know each other well in that sense. It doesn't mean we're a country club, it doesn't mean we're cozy, but I can stand over all of the decisions that we've made in terms of the schools that have been incorporated into the trust and the heads that have been appointed, etc. Over time, of course, that will change, you know, and that's when and that's one of the reasons why we're doing some work at the moment on our cultural cohesion as an organisation, about what really matters to us, what our values are. Bringing those back to the surface, because we don't want to see those stretched too thinly as we continue to grow.
Yeah, that must be really, so, you know, I can't imagine in some ways because I've never done it, but it must be really difficult when you've got 15 schools. So, you know, obviously, like you say, you know most of that, well, all the heads, and you can work closely with them. In some ways, I think when I was in a big company, I was in Capita, you know, ultimately I used to class all customers as critical friends, because you want people to tell you when things aren't going right, but obviously you want them to do it in a way that, you know, that you feel everyone is enabled to be critical, but in a positive way, I guess. And so I think, but if you've got 15 schools, how do you ensure, so obviously you just come on to the subject, but how do you ensure that they all behave in the way that, you know, you want them to, from the, you know, from the MAT perspective? You know, everybody, you know, has the same behaviours, everyone has the same culture, and ensuring that every member of staff, almost, I suppose, has the same opportunity and the same, you know, experience of John Taylor.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's two quite separate questions there. You're right. If I address the second one first, being blunt, there's one employer, and that's John Taylor MAT. Now, all of our colleagues, with the exception of those who joined a free school that was constructed by the MAT, many of them have an experience within their school that predates joining John Taylor MAT. And even those that joined afterwards, many of them have a deep affinity with the school that they're in. And to some extent, we want those colleagues to have some sort of dual identity, where they feel a deep affinity for their local setting, for the community that they serve, for the children and families that they serve, for the colleagues around them, because that's what's drawn them into that particular school as opposed to another one. Although we do want them to feel part of something bigger, part of a family of schools. And we have got colleagues who will move from one school to another within the trust because they want to remain within that family of schools, because they think that we do something that chimes with their own values. And sometimes in any school, the opportunities, eventually you find a ceiling to those opportunities. So what we are increasingly able to do, and again, this becomes part of the geographical footprint argument, is that colleagues where their own aspirations can't be served within their current school, they may well find that their aspirations can be furnished somewhere else, but still within the MAT, because with 10 primaries and 5 secondaries that are in reasonably close proximity to each other, everything becomes commutable in that sense. But in terms of that equality of entitlement, we use a number of systems to try and drive forward that equality of entitlement. I mean, a key aspect of entitlement, of course, is performance management.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we use a system called School IP, and we use that for self-evaluation, for school improvement planning, and for performance management for teaching and support staff.
Yeah.
And what that means is that you can structure the architecture around what those targets will look like, giving certain parameters that need to be followed and putting windows in terms of time when they should be. We can then monitor that through the coagulation of the data that comes then to us. So we can see that those colleagues have an entitlement. We can see that entitlement is being fulfilled in a consistent fashion, and yet we still want to give an element of autonomy and creativity to both the person who is having their performance managed, and the appraiser. We don't set a trust-wide target for performance management on anything other than you have to have your safeguarding up to date. That's pretty much the only thing that we would stipulate. And so it is trying to get that balance between innovation, autonomy, creativity, and standardization, and that reflects across a number of things. If I go on to some of the things that we talk about, often with governing bodies when they're considering joining us, and the senior leaders, they're very interested in where that sliding scale between autonomy and regulation or structure, where that sits. And what I tend to say, Nick, is that in broad brushstroke terms, where there is something that is compliance driven, we are under control. So HR, legal, finance, attendance, those things where you want zero defects, and where actually you don't really want somebody innovating over attendance data. You just need it to be right. So so when it comes to things that are compliance driven, we have systems and structures, a finance system, we use PSF, we use a number of different systems, school IP I've mentioned already, we use My Concern for safeguarding. And so we try and structure that where we have high elements of control. Where things are excellence driven, so where you want, for instance, fantastic behavior, where you want brilliant quality teaching, that's where perhaps we allow much more autonomy, or we try and frame the space so that there is that space for innovation and autonomy. And what we tend to find is that within that space, as our schools are close and they collaborate and they're generous, and one of the things in terms of how do you get these schools to work together, well, we wouldn't take any schools in that were not generous in their spirit and openness in their willingness to make changes. But what we tend to find over time is that in that excellence space, that's where schools begin to align their practice. So without us having to do a grand reveal of this is our new Key Stage 1 curriculum, we begin to find that as schools work together, as they review each other, as they talk to each other, they begin to see that some of their practice could be improved by incorporating some practice from elsewhere, and you begin to see a coagulation of practice. So it's almost kind of Darwinian, really. Those lesser practices, they just get weeded out when it comes to natural selection, as it were. So we do a lot of that, and GDPR was a great example, and I'm just using that because of your audience in terms of technology. When GDPR first came in, our strategic network manager obviously, was kind of like a meerkat, thinking we're going to have to do some stuff here, and did a lot of preparatory work for it. And one of the things that we said to our local governing bodies, many of course have people from a commercial, including an IT background. Please don't worry about this. Please don't fret about this. We're the data controller. It's all trust data. We'll have a link with ICO. We'll have a DPO. We'll sort that. And not a single school said we demand the right to autonomy over GDPR compliance, because they wouldn't. You know,
I don't blame them either.
what they all did, Nick, is you could see their shoulders drop, and they kind of thought, okay, well, now we can concentrate again on serving our community, great teaching, great leadership, great behavior, those things that if the trust is able to do the heavy lifting for us on some of those compliance matters, then actually it doesn't mean our meetings are going to be shorter. It means that they're just going to be focused on things that we really care about.
Yeah.
And I know that in this world there are people who care about GDPR, and I'm not saying people shouldn't care about that, but when it comes to governance, it's what happens to the children in the classrooms that is most important for our governors, and rightly so. And the more that we can do to support them, whether it's policy reviews or whether it's making the finance systems churn out the data in a way that works for them, all of that stuff just means that leaders and governors and teachers can focus on the things that really matter.
Yeah, that makes absolutely perfect. I always think, ultimately, I think lots of teachers, they don't go in for the money necessarily. It's always because it's like a vocation. They care about it. It's really important to them. So you're right. Getting rid of all the things which aren't important, and obviously GDPR is very important, but not important to them and what they're trying to achieve and what they're passionate about. Lead people to be passionate about the things that they care about, and absolutely, I think that's a great that's a great thing. And I think it's a great thing that MATs have. I know not all MATs do it, but I think the more and more MATs I speak to are definitely going, right, we're taking away all the I suppose, like you say, compliance problems away, and allowing you just purely focus on teaching as a teacher, or even as a head sometimes in some of those schools as well.
And it makes ultimate sense, because when it comes to accountability, ultimate accountability with the DFE and with other agencies rests with the trust. If there's a problem in one of our schools, the regional director will call me, or will correspond with the chair of the trust. It won't be actually with the head teacher or with the local governing body. And so for us to have that accountability, we can only really do that in a meaningful sense if we can stand over the systems and the processes for which we are accountable. And when GDPR came in, that was very much at the heart of the messaging to our schools, that ultimately, the register that's left on a bus somewhere is our register as a MAT. It's not the teachers, and it's not even the schools. Of course, we want them to be responsible, but they're not ultimately accountable. And making sure that that's very clear is something that we've tried to do.
So regarding staff CPD, as an example, so is it a little bit, so do you treat it a little bit like, I suppose, assessments? So assessments are now, ultimately teachers now have autonomy in the way that they want to assess children. They need to show it, get it to Ofsted that they are doing something or some form of assessment, but regarding how is normally up to them. And it sounds like you allow all your schools to work with each other to come to sort of best practices, depending on, so they basically all work together to get to that point. You don't dictate to them how they should do it as a MAT.
We talk a lot about co-construction, and co-construction isn't some sort of pithy soundbite. The MAT board is made up of 9 individuals, 8 of which are volunteers, and me. I'm a secondary practitioner by background. So it would be ludicrous for the board to try and micromanage the provision in schools when it comes to the curriculum or what have you. And whilst we have core staff, we have a primary and secondary school improvement partner. We have some secondees who work on particularly important areas for us. So for instance, when the early years framework changed, we had a secondee who was a fabulous early years practitioner who was providing support for all of those schools to make sure that their early years provision was what it needed to be. But even then, Nick, what we do is we work on the basis of network meetings. We work on the basis of coming to a preferred solution. Now, of course, the this goes back to that point of generosity and being open to change. So that only works as a concept if you're prepared to give what you've got, so you're prepared to share your curriculum. And we've got some colleagues who've literally, dragged and dropped their life's work in terms of skills of learning and lesson plans and things into a shared repository for others to see. So we need generosity, but we also need openness, where if teaching medieval Russia is a sacred cow to you at A level, and everybody else, has a very different view, and you're not prepared to change, then that's going to be a problem, because what that then, of course, means is that you can't moderate together, you can't plan together. There's a cost with that, and I sometimes liken that collaboration, from a secondary school background, in terms of how a department works. I used to be a head of a history department, and we didn't all do our own things. And we didn't do our own things for good reason, because we could plan together, we could assess together, we could share ideas, we could divide the workload between us. It was a much more efficient model. We could work on the basis of our expertise, and it worked. And in effect, by looking at a group of schools as we might a group of teachers, and we consider subject or an area across the curriculum being like a department, to allow schools to continue to just do their own thing would be like having an English department where you've got one person teaching Chaucer and another teaching Shakespeare next to each other, and another teaching Orwell. You don't get any sense of cohesion, and you don't get any advantages that come from. So again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that our systems allow for that. So, using SharePoint and using some of the different technologies that are available so that people can share and collaborate. And of course, the advantage when you share something in an organization where you're all part of the same organization is that it then becomes very easy to engage with that person directly. So we could all download a lesson plan on trench warfare from the internet, but if we use one from within our organization, you can then engage with the teacher and say, how long did that activity take? If I were using it more able group, how might I adapt it? So it becomes dynamic rather than static, and rather than just off the peg. So there's real advantages to facilitating that active collaboration within the group.
And that's so different to before, when maths, well, especially geographical maths, were around, because you would always find that, I used to find secondary schools would feel they're in competition with another secondary school nearby, because obviously they're all trying to get students in. They're trying to sort of show that they're better. So you get this sort of, actually, no, I'm going to protect all this stuff. This is my stuff. This is the reason why we are better. But absolutely, the more collaborative approach and learning, that can only benefit children. That's what what it's all about, really. So that's really important. So when sorry, go on.
No, it's just briefly. I was just going to say, even within our close geographical proximity, there is obviously that risk of competition, that risk of competition over admissions and competitions over results and what have you. And again, we're very open in saying we want all of our schools to want to be the best. Yeah. We don't want to curtail their ambition, but what we don't want, and what we of course would make every endeavor to prevent, would be some of those negative behaviors around competition. Which would be people saying, operating in silos, not being prepared to share, not being prepared to collaborate and help. So we're insistent that doesn't happen. But what we don't want to do is we don't want anybody to feel that they have to settle with mediocrity, or we don't have a pecking order. We want all of our schools to want to be the best that they can be, both a best version of themselves. But if that means that they're the best in the area, well, that's fine.
Yeah, I suppose, probably the wrong word is probably competitive. It's more about keep moving the bar up, which means that everybody, the person that's, maybe the school that isn't getting the right result, they still are moving forward and up and basically being or striving for better every time and being supported to do so. by other schools and other colleagues.
Yeah, and you know, we the group of schools is like a cycling peloton, isn't it? You know, that there will always be a yellow jersey rider, you know, and if some are in the slipstream, then that's great. But then over a particular issue or at a particular time, they'll break out from the slipstream and forge ahead, and then the pack will chase them down, and it works that way. But what we insist upon, of course, is that everybody pedals hard.
Yeah.
And that works for us. That's you know, that keeps everybody competitive. So, you know, just as the peloton in a cycling race, they will collaborate for a period whilst they're competing as well, because it's in all of their collective interests to work together to conserve energy and to conserve their work rate, etc. So we do so in our school.
I'll tell you what, it's an amazing analogy actually when you look at like the peloton or look at, you know, ultimately the whole of the like the Tour de France team, Sky team. You know, I know, you know, so David Brailsford and the things, you know, he believes in that 1% marginal gains, where, you know, you have to keep on. So you're the Sir David Brailsford trying to work out where these marginal gains are, but the team itself is now sort of cycling up the hill. Yeah, that's a great analogy really for where you guys are going. In regarding to staff sort of appraisals and stuff, I know you sort of said you use school IP, which is great, and I'm guessing, you know, that enables you to have evidence as well. So, you know, when somebody says, oh, actually, do you know, I think this person could do with this training, or it could be that person comes to you and says, do you know what I'd love to learn is X. I suppose all this can all be stored and enables you then to also have all the data. So if you were looking, if that person was then looking to progress, maybe, I don't know, into a department head or wherever they want to get to, then you've got all that evidence. So that's probably quite important. There's the same with assessment of children as well. And, you know, it's factually.
Yeah, it is. It is, and what we try and do in terms of our development, our staff development model, is there's always a quid pro quo. So if somebody wants to progress to the next level of leadership or of teacher development, because you're right, you know, one thing that we are very keen to articulate is that if somebody wants to be the best teacher that they can be, apologies for that, lesson changeover. If somebody wants to just be the best teacher that they can be, there needs to be a quid pro quo with that. So for instance, if I'm a teacher and I want to be a subject leader, the first step might be for me to be a mentor for a trainee teacher. It may be that I need to find an opportunity to present to colleagues across the trust, whether that's on one of our training days or whether that's electronically to share some of my work. But there's always a quid pro quo. There's always, you need to be exhibiting this set of attributes, qualities, experiences, if we're going to then invest in you on an NPQ or on another leadership pathway, or if we're going to put you into a shadowing opportunity or a secondment or what have you. And I think that that's fair. And I think what that does is it gives gravitas to those opportunities, that those opportunities are earned rather than just granted. And yeah, we do that both in terms of leadership development from aspirant leaders right the way through to system leaders. We also do that for teachers as well in terms of their own journey. But the evidence trail is very important. You know, we know that there was a time when staff development logs, you know, it was they used to call them the wine lists. You know, it used to look like a sort of CV, you know, with a maroon binder or whatever. Those days are gone. You know, and some of our staff will use their own electronic repository for their own CV, in effect. You know, and we've seen some good examples of that. But we do encourage our colleagues to make sure that they keep their own evidence base. It's their professional responsibility to do so. Yeah. And now that we've got 850 moving close towards 1,000 staff, it won't be our job to make sure that their professional records are up to date. That lies with them.
Yeah, and that's really important. You know, I still go into schools where they still have a binder, you know, and they still, you know, all the stuff before was still written. And you sort of go, oh, you know, you do need to. And I think the key point was just what you just said, which is, you know, as an individual, I want to basically progress my career. I don't want to wait for somebody to tell me, when I need to go and do some training. I want to push for my career to go forward. And I think when it's an electronic version, it's easy to do because both people can see it, and you can update it and trigger, I suppose, certain levels of training or certain levels of accountability, and sort of keep pushing your career forward. So I think that's really important.
I have to say though, one thing that many of our colleagues still do, and I'm one of them, is when I'm having a performance management conversation, I will do it with a piece of paper and a pen, and then I will transfer that onto record. Some people feel comfortable typing as they go and putting the objectives in. I don't tend to find that. For me, it runs the risk of becoming sort of booking a seat on a flight. When you're talking and typing at the same time, for me that I lose that sense of engagement. But I can understand if you've got a number of things to do, that's a more efficient way of doing it. But I still go for pen and paper, and then we'll write it up, and then we'll validate that afterwards with the colleague.
I'm with you. I think unfortunately, because of what laptops look like, they basically create that barrier. And I think, you want to always be, especially when you're appraising somebody and talking to somebody, and you want to show that you're interested in them. For me personally, and I agree with you, you just want to make the paper almost at the side so you can just write as you engage.
Yeah.
Absolutely. One other, and I appreciate your time, so thank you very much. But I would really want to ask you a question, because I think it will work for everybody. What are the things? Can you give me 3 things that you feel that basically EdTech companies need to do differently for you? So the things which you go, I never get asked this question, or if I was to open the door to somebody because I'm interested in what they're doing, what are the things that they need to talk to you about, in the sense of what's going to get your attention? And what do you find? Let's ask that question first. So, what are the things that you think EdTech need to be? EdTech companies anyway. What do they need to be talking to you about? What will build your interest?
So, one thing that we have is several different systems, and we've got a finance system, we've got an HR system, we've got a safeguarding system, etc. And I'm quite comfortable with that, because a bit like, you don't want to put all your chips on red, and it comes up black. I don't want us to be too beholden to a single provider that will then know that we're beholden to them, quite frankly, and then you find yourself in a different position. But what I think would be really interesting for us, and what would save me, directors and others some time, is when each of these generates individual dashboards around financial health and around safeguarding outcomes and whatever, something that would be able to talk across each of those systems to say, here's the state of the nation. Here's the state of the nation with this corner about your safeguarding, this corner about your finance, this about your progress against your school improvement plan, this about, the sort of the balanced scorecard that, I did an MBA a long time ago, that would I think really be that sort of that one solution, without necessarily it having to generate all of the inputs for that itself. Because as I say, there may be a company out there that I don't think there is yet that does finance and HR and everything, but I wouldn't want to necessarily put all my chips on red with that. So something that will coagulate that or move it together. And I've seen some really good practice using things like Power BI. There are some really good providers, some good mats out there who are far ahead of where we currently are with moving towards that. But that's something that that would be a kind of nirvana for me to find that sort of experience. So that would pique my interest, something that would build in and splice together those outcome metrics from those different sources. So I guess that would be the answer to that question.
And would you want it to then, without now it's going to solutionizing, which is not about this at all, but would you want it then to also alert you to sort of highlight things where it goes, you're quite close? So attendance, I know it's a simple one, but by the way, at the moment you're on 98% attendance, but actually is starting to drop. It was actually at 99, and you're actually moving down this direction. And here's some of the children who are, are enabling or not enabling, sort of creating this problem.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that with each of those packages, to be fair to them, the sort of the top end data does show, whether it's RAG rating or whether it's bar charts or line graphs or whatever, it does tend to show trends because it's operating at that sort of strategic level. But yeah, things that will flag, the sort of the early warning systems are always useful in terms of things going in the wrong direction. So yeah, that and of course when it's live data, the interesting thing, we have some of those issues around things like assessment, for instance, in terms of tapping into live data, and also the benefits of having data harvests in terms of a window because there's nothing worse than thinking that a child or a department or a school is behind when the following day they'd have updated their data and everything would be back on track. So some of those dilemmas about looking at live data, and we try and educate our governors and directors about that sometimes managing the harvest of data can be really important for us as well. So I think in terms of this nirvana that I'm trying to create, Nick, it wouldn't just have all of the different bits of data on it. It would have some sort of uniform period where it lifts it so that it would be, live, but also relevant in terms of when that data had come in. And so that, that becomes quite an interesting piece, doesn't it, in terms of how that would be managed.
Oh, it's again, going back to the simple analogy or simple description. It's like attendance, isn't it? If you basically if you looked and reported an attendance 4 days into a term, if one person's missing, it sort of skews the whole result. If you look at percentages.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. So yeah, we've got to be very careful with data, but and things like that. Well, I'll tell you what. I'll let you go on to your next question.
So my next question is, where do you take your, I suppose, your information from? Because I think one of the things is you must get bombarded by letters to e-shots and half of them, I'm guessing, and this is just through experience, most of them just go straight into that, into that drawer called the bin, and so it's, or even doesn't even reach you, maybe in lots of cases. So where do you get your information? Do you just get it from other CEOs and MATs? Is it just purely that you talk and identify the solutions you like, or? Yeah,
I mean, mainly, Nick. I mean, I'm fortunate enough to be on a number of networks, which with colleagues who are behind us on some things and ahead on others. And in the same way as we want our schools to share, we share very openly and candidly sometimes. And sometimes the feedback isn't necessarily just what to do, but sometimes what not to do, and that can be also very useful in terms of trying to find a pathway through the jungle, in terms of we tried this and it really didn't work for us. And you make those mental notes in terms of learning from their experience, whether it's good or not so good. But yeah, I mean, some of the networks and forums that I'm on are very useful, and having trusted colleagues that I feel I can ask. I'm not really technologically savvy in any sense, but these things are beyond my understanding, but they're not beyond my imagination, and that I think is the important thing in terms of can I imagine how this would work for us? Can I imagine how this would enrich our experience? Going back to the point that you were making earlier, what solution does this provide for which problem? And there is a tendency in some organizations to look at a solution for a problem that doesn't exist, and to invest an enormous amount of time and effort and capacity into something which needs to then be justified through regular, if not constant, use. And you know, and in terms of a return on investment, you know, there's another bit of MBA language for you. It just doesn't deliver. So I think a healthy degree of skepticism, empirical skepticism, combined with a sense of imagination, if those two things aren't in opposition to each other, which I don't think they are, I think is probably where my filters are. And really going to an Edtech fair isn't going to be where I'm going to get that from. I'm going to get that from my network, through visiting, through seeing it in practice. That will lop off some of the empirical concerns, and then seeing how something might align with our organization as it is now is an imaginative process. So yeah, long answer to a short question is I ask people who know more than I do, you know, and then see how it will fit.
Do you know, I think you picked up on all the things I think is really important, which I don't think enough of us do in Edtech sometimes. Well, some company definitely I've come across it. I think it's more about listening to rather than broadcasting and saying, by the way, I can do this for you, where you might go, like you said, well, I don't have that problem. You know, it's more about actually listening and sort of going, you know, tell me where your problems are, and I'll see if I can help, sort of type of attitude. Because, like you say, you know, I think education itself, I think schools and education leaders, you know, are innovative, because you have to be. You know, you're juggling so much. You just have to be innovative. You have no choice almost, and because you're always looking for how do you increase performance of the children, more importantly than anything else. So I think you're always trying to, you know, think of new things and new ways of doing things. And as you said, you know, maybe you might not be technically, you know, aware of all the things that tech can do, but once you listen, you know, once we've listened, then, you know, it's easy. It should be easier then to say, oh, actually, this is what we could do to, you know, deliver your reports, as an example. So I think it's really important to listen.
And in terms of innovation, it's always worth remembering, Nick, that a major investment in one solution can actually curtail future innovation, and that's also, you know, worth thinking about when an organization goes wholesale for a single solution. You then are basically locking yourselves in to that solution, and if it's the right one, then that's brilliant. If it's not, your exit strategy out of that single solution could be very, very difficult, very costly, and very painful. So yeah, it's that's where the skepticism, I think, comes in, you know.
Yeah, no, I can understand that 100%. So Mike, really great talking to you, and thank you very much for your time. If there's one thing or two things you'd like to get across to the people listening to this, what would you say?
Be focused on solving the problems that we have, and remember that people want things that just work. You know, things that will be intuitive, things that will when people are sort of time poor, that will switch on, be good to go, will be reliable, and will deliver what they want, and, you know, and keeping it simple in that sense. Simple and reliable works for me.
Oh, I'm so with you. Do you know, that's such a great point to end on. I think that sort of frictionless sort of solution, you shouldn't even know it's there, is exactly where people need to get to. You know, as you said, you know, all you guys, you know, everybody within your organization are so busy. So, you know, what you don't want is to basically be sort of pressing the next button like 1,000 times. How do I get here? Amazing. A really big thank you for your time. You know, it's really appreciated. It's really insightful. I love the analogy of the peloton as well. I'm going to keep that in my mind. I'm definitely going to talk about that as well, because I think it's really important. What a great analogy to have about, especially from a mat perspective, keeping everybody moving in the right direction, and yet enabling people to be, you know, individuals, and, you know, and I suppose, you know, to benefit again the overall peloton. I think is really important. What a great analogy. So yeah, I'm going to keep hold of that. And it's a big thank you from me, and I think people are going to find this really informative. So a big thank you. You know, I know your time is really precious. So
no problem,
great.
Yeah, I hope people do find it valuable. Yeah, I hope so.
They will, for sure. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Nick. Take care.
Take care.